5, 4, 3, 2.
Okie doke. Hey there, hi there, ho there. Um, 6th day of June. Welcome to Dis and Dat. It won't resemble what you were just looking at, although it may seem like that at times. Let me just say that I think it's been a tough slog, and I'm hoping there will be only one more day of this tedium. So tomorrow at 5, I will finish this Tupinamba article on the Commons. And no, I'm not going to get too far down into the Borromeo or the Borromean knot. But I think it's important to think about this as a way of reconsidering the original question of whether there is a commons and what does that commons look like, and can be a commons that is not not so constrained, or that contains within it the problem of private versus public versus personal. Although I think that's what's going on here with the article, ultimately in terms of what its contribution to what some people might refer to as radical subjectivity. The idea that there's certainly a kind of revolutionary potential, and we can see that in demonstrations and marches, but there's a moment at which just simply intervening into the commons doesn't necessarily always get what it should. That's kind of if we're going to be cynical about it, you can have a 1 million person march, and that's cool. It has a place in history, I suppose. And you can obsess about crowd size like the last president did, but it's more than crowd size. It is about consciousness. And I think that what our author here is doing to Zizek's basic idea is to say that, at some moment you have to not just do marches. You have to think about the other ways in which one's sense of estrangement or alienation operates. How does that operate? That the march itself should be able to synthesize something more meaningful, let's say, more revolutionary, as it were. Now, I think that's the optimistic side of it. The more pessimistic side of it is to see it simply as a larger kind of public phenomenon, a way in which you could think about the mood, the climate, the popular climate in that sense, the where the public is sort of at. But the question is, do these people marching in the street represent me? I like to think that they do most times. There really aren't that many pro-abortion 1 million person marches, which is interesting also in and of itself. The Catholic Church does do that actually once a year in the United States. That's where the kid from Covington, Kentucky, made fun of the Native American, and a punk. Needless to say, by now I think he's graduating from college. Unfortunately, I still remember who he is, and I'd never hire him. But that's the question, isn't it? Though the question of labor. So anyway, let me get started here, and I think you'll see where this is going, how it will conclude. I mean, if there's a conclusion to this, it's not a spoiler alert. And in the next section on Friday, we'll look at the difference between strong and weak nature, as I seem to recall it. That it's got lots of diagrams in this article, and the real point is that our relationship to nature is being articulated or sort of extended. And I think that you want to think about the details, because the details, that's where it is. It is these the granular elements of how we do stuff. I think it's important to note that if you're going to do a march or a demonstration or protest, that they have everything going on in it That is, that it fully engages the public. For example, if you have one of these protests and not enough people are paying attention, you're really having a protest in that sense. I had a friend who would every weekend or month, I guess, they would go out to the Hanford nuclear facility to protest at the gate. And well, some people knew that it was going on, but it was sort of this, and they do this in England as well. There's anti-nuclear protests that go on constantly, and we don't know enough about them. I think they need more press presence, more people, and so it now what we're trying to do here is not talk about the commons as simply something you intrude on or you appropriate or you frame in a different way, but rather to talk about the entire sort of capitalist project and the way in which even protest gets marginalized in the big picture. The Trump rally, for example, is unfortunately, with all due respect, like a Grateful Dead concert. There are people who drive multiple states over to go to these silly things, and so it's not really gathering steam. And as some people discover, the idiot says the same thing all the time without much variation. And so, unless you're really into the shtick, as in a cult, you sort of get tired of it. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, Zizek, one of the shark, not a shark. Zizek is, he's an acquired taste, and but there is actually a theory. Zizek actually has a theory, so not just one theory, but I think that what he's doing is trying to extend, as the author, this Brazilian author does, is just try and say, well, there's this stuff going on, and we need to sort of extend the theoretical element, see what's useful. And Zizek's extension of what Lacan is talking about, we ask this kind of question: Can language do these kinds of things, and should the language do these kinds of things? And I think that we need to reappreciate, with all due respect, the issues of what Lacan offers. Lacan was revived during a certain period because you could see that it was possible to look at Lacan and say, well, I think I can look at an entire in a Lacanian way and see what was going on. Now, it's very sad that some of us, and I'm not a Lacanian by any means, but it's my observation that occasionally, and this is not common to all episodes of The Twilight Zone, there is a psychotic break at work. And it's interesting to note what that psychosis is. Often the viewer is led into the psychosis. In other senses, it's not. And then you have the little kind of irony twist at the end with Rod giving his commentary to kind of reposition the frame. And that's interesting to me. The moments where you get sort of, oh, well, this is going somewhere, and then it goes, and then the twist occurs. This is M. Night Shyamalan, blah blah. You get kind of an inversion, as it were, the meaning, and then psychotic break, and you need to decide, Rod, help me out of this or not. So that's kind of the way in which you can think about this. The Borromean knot is in some ways a way of thinking about the symptom, which is kind of what you get in the text. Anyway, I'm not going to go too far down the road of this, but there was a moment where some people, and particularly feminists, because it was easy to sort of arrange all the signs in the right place, to see how you could take certain films and evaluate it on that basis. All right. The structure to which the Borromean knot refers corresponds to the link of the three registers. That is, the the registers of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The registers of a speaking subject. You speak in a kind of a sort of a register. That is, there's a kind of, as it were, the ways in which we present the utterance and then how we decode and code them. So the record of the real, the record of the imaginary, and the record of the symbolic. the idea of a register, of course, does actually apply computationally, but that's a whole nother story. In this model, the three rings represent the edges or holes in a body around which the desire flows. The idea of Lacan is that psyche is itself a space in which its edges are intertwined in a knot, which is at the center of being. Now, I know that's very heavy and very, lots of psych stuff, but it is this idea and that its relationship to the whole, that is not the whole as in hole in a donut, but as the whole in the totality of things. In 1975, Lacan decided to add a fourth ring to the configuration of three. And it is called symptom. And that's what we get is symptomatic elements. I think in Twilight Zone, you can see whether things are or are not symptomatic. And then you can see the disorder or order kind of, messed up in the narrative. According to Lacan's explanation, it would be this fourth element that keeps the psyche locked up. And in some Twilight Zone episodes, that's exactly what happens. You see the psyche liberated. That is, in order to move the narrative forward, you can see the dilemma that occurs. Anyway, from a narrativity point of view. From this perspective, the objective of the Lacanian analysis is to unlock the link by breaking the knotting of the symptom. That is the symptom. That is, untie this fourth ring. Now, the fourth ring is only determined by the linking of the three rings. And if you break any one of the rings, the entire thing collapses. So this is that moment. And you could say that any one of in sort of the real world, mass murders are spree killings are kind of those strange things which are oftentimes disturbing. And you can see sometimes where these happen and other times where you see the links also actually come together again, and the legal system in some ways brings all those things together. That's kind of what was going on with the Trump trial. That is, nothing happened. It's not a crime. I never had sex with those women. Blah, blah, blah. That's the symptom that we have, though the full denial can achieve that, and it doesn't when you have all the receipts. So symptom is a concept introduced by Lacan in the seminar, the 75 to 76 seminar. It redefines the psychoanalytic symptom in terms of the role of the subject outside of analysis. That is, the subject is not in an analytic situation, talking to the shrink, where enjoyment is made possible through creative identification with the symptom. This occurs in the Twilight Zone plot where, they become, part of the future narrative, whether it's good or bad or crazy or whatever, diluted, you can see that at work. Now, at other times that you don't have this kind of perfect symmetry, chaos occurs, whatever. In its beginnings, Lacanian psychoanalytic theory proposes the Borromean knot as a model of the subject's psychic structure, understanding the structure as a metaphor in the signifying chain. You see, this is how you can analyze, with all due respect, a Twilight Zone episode. That is, there is a signifying chain. There's a bunch of things that are, linking the plot together, and you as the audience are trying to make sense of this whole business. And then it kind of, it depends on what Serling decides or Beaumont decides to do, whether you're going to hinge it or unhinge it or take it in a whole new direction. So he conceives of the triggering, psychotic by then, and that's why I make the joke about psychotic breaks in Twilight Zone, as the breaking of a link in that chain. Now, by comparison, Columbo tends to always have all the links are being sort of reassembled because we have the psychotic event at the front end, and we see all of the attempts by the protagonists to try and put all the links back together, and our friend Columbo sort of identifies this sort of where the break occurred or didn't occur only simply by some sign or symptom where we guess together whether Columbo knows who the killer is. It would be a terribly boring one if every killer in Columbo stood on their right to silence. It would be making a longer episode probably. Ideology, according to de Zizek, now we're back into the actual text itself, according to Zizek, veils a sublime object that differs in essence from the real that it represents and holds an uncanny influence over cognition at the individual and group levels. In Lacanian theory, ideology is separated from the real by fantasy. From the clinical perspective, passing through the fantasy resolves the conflict arising from the gap between the real and the ideal, that can, if it remains unconscious, become the object of neurosis or obsession. What exists at this gap is a non-thing that Lacan refers to as the objet petit a. So, yes, we're not totally at the text yet, actually. There's a little diversion to explain the lowercase a in the diagram that we were looking at yesterday. It is a reflection of an attempted psychology formed in reaction to the conceived perceptual gaze of the other being the super egogic determiner of the ideological ethic and or adjudicator of its realness or acceptability. Essentially, forming in reaction in some ways could be defined as the relegitimation of something. That is when the killer in the Columbo series offers up can't keep their mouth shut and starts explaining potential narratives to Columbo, and Columbo being Columbo, sees that this activity is some deflection or psychosis or some other kind of thing. And it's really no different than Trump trying to react on Truth Social to any other idiotic thing he blurts out of his mouth. This reflection masks a specific kind of desire that can never be completely assuaged, just as an ideology can never be completely realized. So this is an unrealized element. And so Zizek hops on this idea. The sublime object of the ideal then is not the ideal itself, but the ever negated object, small case a, the symptom, fed and sustained by the surplus desire, that little bit of a valence that draws one repeatedly back to the ideal. And you can see that, right? I mean, we've seen Columbo episodes where, it gets so wacky that the criminal, the killer, goes out and kills another person or whatever. Not too often, but occasionally. And Zizek describes this as a traumatic kernel or void, like a nebulous black hole of negative space, which sounds pretty awful. Zizek explains that although you can never quite put your finger on the real by accurately representing it with symbols, because it's a void-like essence that defies objectification, it paradoxically exercises a certain structural causality, can produce a series of effects in the symbolic reality of subjects. As such, the antagonism between the obscurity of Lacan's small case a and jouissance becomes the real, the fundamental essence of reality. So I would assert, if you look at a film called Free Guy, that the non-player character played by Ryan Reynolds is that exact sort of set of consciousness. And there's two narratives. There's the narrative of the guy, the blue shirt guy in the computer simulation, and who appears to be sentient, and the code being manipulated by various gamers, game programmers, coders, and that it ultimately resolves itself, spoiler alert, as a 19th century romantic thing. So it's essentially a rom-com, but with a lot of technology and a lot of CGI. So that may seem terrible to you, but that's kind of just what it is. And it's very fun to watch. And it does have certain musings about the gamer community and the economy of the gamers. So I think that it's actually a very good material narrative itself as well. Because there's a tremendous argument about intellectual property that goes on in there. It has to do with corporate power. It personifies corporate power in single individuals, and it has a kind of reflection on the incel-like task of the serious game program. So anyway, all of those things. So paradoxical examples of antagonism. Remember, throughout all these yammerings of mine, we've been looking at the kind of motivating issue, the issue of why do these things, because there are antagonisms in here, and if there's any place for Zizek's sort of meandering about this, it is to identify the origins of capitalist crisis. That is, the Marxian capitalist, analysis of capital tends to look at crisis as a problem in diminished returns from problems in the acquisition of surplus value and capitalist accumulation's natural, as it were, failure. Well, it is a sort of natural failure, but why is it occurring? And it occurs because of defects in the social relations. That is, you go from individual psychosis to mass psychosis. And it is a kind of general argument in the humanist analysis of Marxism that the subject, that is the worker, the laborer, gets messed up somehow. One way or the other is made less human by work. And so this dehumanizing, it's not just a simple matter of simply blow up the machines, but rather rethink what is it that our subjectivity is operating at. So that's kind of been the general project at a humanist level. But what Zizek is doing is saying, well, we've had all these kind of technological advances, technical in the sense of psychological mechanisms. We've had all these advances in analysis of the subject since Freud, and let's take advantage of this way in which we can cope with what is a very traditional Platonic problem. What appearances are we messing with, and does it relate to the future or the present? And what is it about this that is both good and bad? And you want to sort of get into why that is. Now, some people will say the jouissance of Trumpists is cruelty and a peculiar male cruelty or male identified cruelty. So that's one way in which you could go off into the sunset. Another way is to simply say that it's just about power. It's acquiring power over people. You could buy Supreme Court judges, justices, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a set of desires. Certainly, Harlan Crow has a certain desire to control people, and how much more better is it to control people than specifically control a Black person, which is just the irony of ironies, I suppose. And so I think there's this kind of mercenary thing that goes on in Clarence Thomas' brain about sticking it to Black Democrats by taking rich white guys' money to the tune of now $4 million, as I understand it in the current reporting. So the realness of the antagonism, and it is Clarence Thomas's own antagonism about racism, not only without, that is, whites against blacks, but racism in Clarence's mind within the kind of fallacies built into liberal versions of affirmative action, et cetera. So I'm not claiming to have that particular answer, but I think you can see that going on with Clarence Thomas and Ginny Thomas. So the realness of the antagonism that's distinct from the inadequacies of the assertion of the real appears in the American socio-political landscape in hot-button issues like the irreducibility of ethical and material perspectives on abortion. There is irreducibility in these perspectives. Some that engage themselves in some bizarre activity. The entire state of Texas is a mess, I would assert, as a result. Who else would put a bounty on informing on people who cross state lines to get medical procedures? You just want to think about that. What's going on there? What economy is going on there? So are the alternating places of race and the racialized and the explicit discourse of implicit bias? So there you go. This is why the Washington Post sat on the Alito stories for so long. I think they thought they could probably use it at some moment. It was too early to do it when it did appear, but now that we're in this a really very difficult place, it's time to pop the thing out there, and there's facts there. So the facts are, they're really difficult. My wife did it. The one thing that both parties are unified in at the fiercest moments of opposition is the antagonism itself. So, that's Fox News. Fox News is about the commodification of antagonism itself. So it is not, that's one way that you can take the entire set of analysis, that kind of media analysis of the commodification of antagonism. That's fine, but that doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't. We've been doing this for decades now, since Fox News was created, essentially on the same premise and a continuing premise. So anyway, back to the original Tupinamba story, is the estrangement of the commons. So the point here in general is that we're looking at different ways in which things are alienated. Alienate on the basis of property. You can alienate in a much more personal kind of way. One's relationship to nature and the land. In the Lockean sort of sense, I like where I've been. The soil is nice. I get to alter it a little bit and make it good. I love growing stuff. And not only do I love growing stuff, that we get something back for it or, whatever. It helps sustain us in a larger sense. But then, we get kicked off the land. We have to go to the city. We have to figure out other ways to survive. And we're not going to go farming in the city, although we could. Distinguishing the commons from the community form poses, however, serious theoretical difficulties. For example, when Zizek declares that we must not only recognize the qualitative difference between the enclosures of culture and nature and the enclosure of people, note, of course, this is that whole point that he's making, that enclosing culture and nature turns into concentration camps. Enclosure of people. This is that weaponizing of architecture that Kelly was talking about. But also conceive struggle against the former from the standpoint of the latter. How is this strategically different from espousing a political program based on social inclusion? So it's clearly anti-democratic. Furthermore, if we suspend our commitment to the presupposition that the access to the commons is essentially communitarian, that is, if we're faced with the possibility that those who are segregated from the social space, coloreds only water fountains, etc., do not necessarily share among themselves or with others any effective common ground, how could the standpoint of the excluded be affirmatively conceived? To address these issues, let's return once more to the crisis of value. Less seduced by the ideological effects brought by the new role of the cultural commons in contemporary capitalism, we're now in position to trace its consequences to the other fragments of the working class. In our initial analysis of the structural transformations brought about by the shift in hegemonic form of surplus extraction, we noticed that a fundamental difference between a capitalist mode of production centered on the extraction of absolute surplus directly from the worker's labor time and one centered on the relative extraction through increases in productivity concerns the latter's breaking of a certain silent pact between workers and capitalists. The horizon of full employment, that is, the common view that a society of work is a desirable or attainable future. Remember, this is this issue that we see sort of Baudelarized in fully automated luxury communism. And this is, Weeks, who actually is a really, this is the same Weeks, and I can't remember, who does a really great job on a Marxist version of microeconomics. Anyway, the normative expectation of wage work as an individual responsibility has more to do with the socially mediating role of work than its strictly productive function. Work is the primary means by which individuals are integrated not only into the economic system, but also into social, political, and familial modes of cooperation. That individuals should work is fundamental to the basic social contract. Indeed, working is part of what is supposed to transform subjects into the independent individuals of the liberal imaginary. For that reason, is treated as a basic obligation of citizenship. The fact that the economy's health is dependent on a permanent margin of unemployment is only one of the more notorious problems with this convention. This is libertarianism. Dreams of individual accomplishment and desires to contribute to the common good become firmly attached to waged work, where they can be hijacked to different ends to produce neither individual riches nor social wealth, but privately appropriated surplus value. You're just not working hard enough. The category of the work society is meant to signify not only the centrality of work, but also its broad field of social relevance. Work could be seen as a principle of social synthesis insofar as the underlying logic, there's a Protestant ethic here, behind, Weber, behind absolute surplus extraction, that the principle guarantees a certain cycle, binding the increase of time employed in the production process with the increase in wage labor is capable of buying back the commodities being produced, right? You need to work so that you can afford whatever. This is the Henry Ford car that can be afforded by workers, but without a discount. But one of the principal effects of the increasing centrality of relative surplus value extraction, itself caused by the structural exhaustion of the present moment, is that this guarantee becomes unsustainable, not as a reality, which it never was, but as a horizon which promoted social homogeneity. Conformity is important here. Conformity allows the police to do whatever the hell they want because we don't protest enough. It allows us to be placed in a situation where bulletproof vests are now seen as an offensive weapon. It can be charged that way, in fact. The elimination on a mass scale of living productive labor as a source of the creation of value can no longer be recuperated by newly mass-produced cheap products, since this process of mass production is no longer mediated by a process of reintegrating a labor population that is made superfluous elsewhere, right? The idea of cheap labor elsewhere offshore. This brings about a historically irreversible overturning of the relationship between the elimination of living productive labor through scientification on the one hand, that is technology, and absorption of living productive labor through processes of capitalization or through the creation of new branches of production on the other, new products. From now on, it is inexorable that more labor is eliminated than can be absorbed. Remember how this is happening, right? The scanning stations at your supermarket. All technological innovations that are to be expected will tend only in the direction of further elimination of living labor. All new branches of production will from the outset come to life with less and less direct human productive labor. There are stores now, I think England has more of them than the US, where you can go in, there are no people, you just take the thing off the shelf, make sure you get it scanned, I suppose, and you walk out. Well, I assume it has more safeguards of one kind or another. I've never been in one, so someone should tell me exactly how they operate. The first volume of Capital offers us two distinct entry points. Remember, we talked in, and this is a Rick Wolf deal from Althusser, is this idea that you have multiple entry points. And yes, the multiple entry points kind of look like that Borromean knot in some ways. The first, a logical analysis of the secret of the commodity form, introduces us to the laws of commodity exchange, that is, laws written in social hieroglyphs, right? Prices, for example. Well, the second, a historical analysis of the secret of permanent accumulation, introduces us to the constitution of the labor commodity, a history written in letters of blood and fire. However, as Fred Jameson suggests, when these perspectives are forced together, Capital reveals itself to be neither a book about the logical exploitation of the use value of concrete labor, nor about the historical constitution of abstract labor, but rather a book about unemployment. And that's kind of what it is, that you can concretize this. You don't need, use values being exploited, and, you have to deal with layers of abstraction to do it. The basic thing is it's wage labor and unemployment. Unemployment has often been grasped as the ideological other face of a whole political program based on the call for full employment. And while I think this slogan might be good and invigorating for us in the current conjuncture, particularly since it's unrealizable within the system, it's normal actually to have a 2% to 3% unemployment rate, and because it's seasonal, and therefore calculated to dramatize everything non-functional about its structure, I believe that it is not necessary to invoke this political and ideological strategy when insisting upon the fundamental structural centrality of unemployment in the text of Capital itself. Marx does not there call for the correction of this terrible situation by a policy of full employment. Rather, he shows that unemployment is structurally inseparable from the dynamic of accumulation and expansion, which constitutes the very nature of capitalism as such. And let me just stop here for a second to note that some of us for X number of reasons, decide to quit our jobs without having another job lined up. We prefer to do it the other way around, to have another job lined up to leave to, but sometimes that just can't fucking happen for X number of reasons, and we can talk about that later. But, some of us voluntarily choose to be unemployed. It suggests that those massive populations around the world who have, as it were, dropped out of history, who have been deliberately excluded from the modernizing project of first world capitalism and written off as hopeless or terminal cases, the homeless, the subjects of so-called failed states, a new and self-serving pseudo-concept of ecological disaster, of old-fashioned survivals of allegedly immemorial archaic ethnic hatreds, the victims of famine, whether man-made or natural, all these populations at best confined in camps of various kind and ministered to by various NGOs and other sources of international philanthropy, our reading suggests that these populations, surely the vessels of a new kind of global and historical misery, will look rather different when considered in the terms of the category of unemployment. Note that that's what refugees are about, is about unemployment. And in fact, but you can't overdetermine that. I mean, the issue of southern border migration is an employment issue, but it's also a certain set of other things. It's about family unification. But the idea is, if you have too many illegal people on one side of the border and they're doing capital export, essentially making extra money and sending the surplus back to their home country, this is problematic because in some ways that surplus is not being used in the American economy. And so that's a whole other set of issues. It isn't because of cross-border flows of capital, but you want to think about what people's motivations are in that context. It is, in fact, when we conceive of unemployment as an active element of the capitalist dynamic of accumulation, that we're able to truly conceptualize the enclosure of labor as a commodity. This was that whole point. We started at the beginning, that enclosure can be applied not simply as land, but it can be applied to labor as well. I would assert that you can apply this also to capital, but that's a whole other story. If we adopt the logical entry point into capital, looking at the labor commodity as we do any other product of the capitalist mode of production, it is only by considering the social relation between a given worker and the rest of the unemployed workforce that we can truly grasp the determinants for the exchange value of this commodity. Now, note, of course, this is Marx 1867. This is the later Marx. And so what we have is the juxtaposition and the unification, if you will, of the early Marx, looking at the human side, and the late Marx, the more productive, productivist Marx. That is, in terms of the writings of Capital during the kind of formative period between 1853 and 1869 or whatever it is. When Marx writes that the value of a commodity is given by the socially necessary labor time that goes into its reproduction, we must also extend the reach of this definition to include the value of the labor commodity, which is constituted as such in relation to the labor power potentially at disposal in the market. So this is all about thinking about employment or unemployment or underemployment. The unemployment of others is therefore a determinant for the conditions of employment of some. But unemployment also helps us to clarify aspects of the historical approach to capitalism, the one that begins with primitive accumulation. This is that point, the humanist point, and the critique of settler colonialism is to think about what primitive rather than capitalist accumulation is. In fact, it helps us to see that historically, unemployment precedes employment. Now, this is an inversion. This is important to think about. Workers were first freed from their means of subsistence, deprived of ways to make direct use of their own active forces. And only through this privation is that labor power emerges as a homogeneous substance. Now, this is sort of saying, well, Marx makes this artificial idea about the difference between labor and labor power. And, why is he making it abstract? Well, on the other hand, you need to have that abstraction to fulfill this idea of, well, what causes this, which can be employed as an expenditure of time in different productive contexts. And that was Marx's point is, well, what's the common variable here? In other words, unemployment functions as a form of enclosure, a form of privation, which has a formal role in molding one's heterogeneous capacities into the negative and homogeneous power that is labor time as a private property. So this is this question, as I mentioned before, that if you work part-time that is underneath a full-time, 40-hour work week, if you're working at 29 hours, the employer doesn't have to do certain things in terms of the surplus value. You get your pay at 29 hours, but you don't get certain benefits, or certain things don't get deducted, or blah, 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 because you're in the gig economy. Finally, when considered one's own unemployment is a condition for labor to be abstracted into a commodity that has use value for others, while the others' unemployment, the other people's unemployment, is a condition for this commodity to have exchange value and therefore revert into wages for oneself. It's how you sort of measure it, right? The $15 an hour. Which is why, when summarizing the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation, Marx does not constrain his analysis to the extraction of from workers employed by capitalists, but rather points to the distinction, and this is this scale question that I've raised before, scope and scale, the reserve army and the reserve army of labor and the active labor army. This is what the how the gig economy sort of works. It is playing with the margins in that sense. This is the reason why, had Marx worked in a university, written his work and did his research in a university, I think he would have got further along. The greater the social wealth, the functioning capital, the extent and energy of its growth, and therefore also the absolute mass of the proletariat and the productiveness of its labor, the greater is the industrial reserve army. The same causes which develop the expansive power of capital develop also the labor power at its disposal. The relative mass of the industrial reserve army increases, therefore, with the potential energy of wealth. But the greater this reserve army in proportion to the active labor army, these two armies here, one in reserve, one actually fighting the battle as we're producing, the greater is the mass of a consolidated surplus population whose misery is in inverse ratio to its torment of labor. The more extensive, finally, the Lazarus layers of the working class, the industrial reserve army, the greater is official pauperism. This is this debt thing. This is the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. It's debt and credit and all that stuff. Like all other laws, it is modified in its working by many circumstances, the analysis of which does not concern us here. And the not concern us here is actually kind of important when you think about, the volume 2 and volume 3 of Capital. At first, the distinction between the surplus population and the active working class seems secondary, sociologically verifiable, but theoretically unimportant, given that to extract absolute surplus value, capitalists must employ as many workers as possible, benefiting from employment rates only insofar as they drive the price of labor down. But with the so-called crisis of value, the unemployed can no longer be conceived of as the potentially employable or the not yet employed, the underemployed. Instead, under the aegis of relative surplus extraction, it is the active worker who must begin to consider his condition as worker as an accidental or momentary expression of his more essential role as increasingly superfluous laborers. This is the gig economy. Just as the crisis of value prompted a massive return to the direct spoliation of common resources and an expansion of its reach to include the privatization of cultural production, so as it also brought forth a forgotten truth about the labor commodity in capitalism, that its very commodification, remember commodity is the front end of Capital, of the book Capital, is shaped by the phantasm of those who cannot work. Remember how this is operative in the right-wing discourse, right? There are all these slackers out there, right? Using food stamps and shit like that, right? However, while the huge masses of unemployed in early capitalist times still had a growing industry to absorb them in its expansion cycles, the new hordes of people without work can no longer count with the same horizon. Jameson notes, this does not mean that this increasingly unemployable surplus population is falling out of the capitalist system. They remain a crucial part of the dynamic, not only through informal and sub-employment or through the help of credit and social programs, which qualify them as consumers of the ever-growing commodities flooding the market, but also as a social pressure, which conforms active labor force to the commodified status. And in short, the crisis of value entails an inversion in the relation between employment and unemployment. This is how the wall of enclosure build, a shift which is made possible because of the structural relation between active and idle work in the very constitution of the labor commodity. So this is the way of thinking about this as not quite as simple, assuming that, you can always get work, or there's always structural unemployment. And in fact, the state mechanisms to look at this human resource. Now, this transformation affects not only the relation between workers and capitalists, it also affects the structure of the working class itself. In the previous sections, we saw that the new role of the cultural commons in the production of surplus has led to the constitution of certain immediate ties between cultural workers to the particular conditions of intellectual work and cooperation. But we can now place this transformation in context by considering it together with the new conditions of active and unemployed workers. So what Jameson does, now Jameson has never been unemployed, so this is a fiction, as it were, considering that he would say, he was making six figures as a full professor endowed chair. He's had a couple of those, and moving around from place to place, etc. So, this is specious at best. Within the horizon of the society of work, cultural work was not entirely privatized at all. So it was considered superfluous in a way, while wage work directly employed in the production process was considered by workers and capitalists alike the essential element of economic development. The unemployed counted as potential workers. This is how kind of labor power could operate, either to be employed as the industry developed or in place of someone else, that is, replacing someone. In short, there was material and structural cohesion guaranteeing the social homogeneity of the working class as its different fractions were glued together by reference to future work. While the collapse of this horizon, however, what we get is not a shift from manual to cultural work as the essential component of valorization. Oh, why don't you learn how to use a computer, etc. And neither, do stuff in intellectual and that kind of work and digital work. And neither do we witness the end of the working class. Instead, we see the constitution of three separate groups, which, while remaining essential parts of the production process, have no social cohesion between them. A social class made of sharp edges. So that Zizek talks about this sharp-edgedness, which, it may be that Zizek is just working in the interstices by adding a new little categories for us to play with, and that's fine. I think it actually has it can have a material outcome. As if the three components of the production process, that is intellectual planning and marketing, Marx doesn't account for that in the, capital, in the equation in some ways. Material production, which he does, providing a material resource, sort of, are more and more autonomized, emerging as three separate spheres. In its social consequences, this separation appears in the guise of the three main classes of today's developed societies, which are precisely not classes, but three fractions of the working class. That is, intellectual laborers, those of us who punch buttons, the old manual working class, actually, sand stuff and cut stuff, the outcasts, the unemployed or living in the slums or other interstices of the public spaces, the unhoused, etc. So that's the three fractions. The proletariat is thus divided into three, each part played off against the others. Intellectual labors full of cultural prejudices against the redneck workers, workers who display populist hatred of intellectuals and outcasts, and the outcasts who are antagonistic to society as such. And you can see the overlap among all of these things, because in good cognitive dissonance, you can hold all of these things simultaneously. So we get back to, or towards, table 1, which you can expand at your leisure. It has 6 columns and 4 rows, and you can see what the emphasis here is on the idea of the fourth antagonism. In other words, the 4 categories of the commons in terms of the relationship to the productive sphere. Remember, we have the productive sphere and sort of, as in volume 2 of Capital, the consumption or exchange sphere. The forms of enclosure which allow for their commodification, the sort of antagonism the process gives rise to, and there's a rise that comes from this enclosure. The fraction of the working class that is most affected by this antagonism outcasts, for example, in the case of external culture. And the focus here is on the adaptations made to the fourth antagonism, formulated here as that of external culture. Now, this is the same thing that in a previous thing I was rambling about was the lumpen proletariat, right? I mean, outcasts. There are a lot of outcasts. Some who pretend that they're outcasts because they're outcasts, but others who are psychologically impaired sufficiently not to be able to. I mean, that the outcast is normal for all kinds of reasons, functionally or dysfunctionally. Now, there's table 2, which identifies the more specific element of the antagonism, that is the monopoly of alienation. So this is how the barrier, the enclosure, the not necessarily physical, but it is constructed. And if you take the Israel-Gaza thing, you can see how it's being created even better when the Israelis go in and bomb every fucking university and college in Gaza, and there are plenty of them, and that's what is interesting. There's no reason to do it. It's infrastructure. Oh no, they can have snipers at the top of the building. That's why we're going to bomb it. Whatever. This table reconstructs Slavoj Žižek's theory of the antagonism of the commons, dividing the 4 categories of the commons in terms of the relationship to the productive sphere. The focus is on adaptations made to the fourth antagonism, reformulated as that of external culture. So the next section is the commons of external culture, and I'm running out of time. Let's see. The thing here is this idea that you can base into Marx this larger question, which is often referred to as species being in Marx. And here it is referred to as a kind of generic being. And so what Žižek and the author here are trying to do is to give us a difference that is not defined simply by property, but that there is a difference between, and it's one pursued by some people in elemental form. Bertel Owen's book kind of gets at that. And this is this idea that there's a difference between estrangement as a larger, more general structural category and alienation at a more base level, I suppose. And this is this problem. So let's see. Dialectics of externalization, which allow Marx to explain the 2 aspects of capitalist society, which from the standpoint of capital, which be later conditioned by the structural function of unemployment. The relation between workers and non-workers is explained through the preserved natural bond between man and his species. That is, are we, do we work to live or live to work? While the abstract dimension of labor is explained by the fact that our natural capacity for externalizing ourselves is not bound to any immediate need in particular. And this raises a larger question, proposed by a whole bunch of other writers about the question of necessity. Hegel's theory of estrangement or alienation consequently reduced to its juridical interpretation. This is where law comes in, right? This is the Code of Capital argument, partially, quite possibly due to the critical importance that his philosophy of right had for Marx in those years. The philosophy of right is kind of the introductory Hegelian text that you read before Marx, because it's kind of the thing that Marx reacts to relative to the young Hegelians, blah, blah, blah. Alienation is only introduced with private property. First, as alienation of the product of man's natural exteriorization, that is, this is the first natural move, and then it's the alienation of the capacity for exteriorization in general, now placed in the service of man's animal subsistence. So this is the difference between, on the one hand, basic labor, that is what you need to get the fuck out of the bed in the morning, and then sort of the larger sense of, well, how am I going to survive today? Let us call the hypothesis of strong nature. So there's a strong nature and a weak nature. I think I can return to this later on. You can figure this out for yourself, but you can see exteriorization, estrangement, and reappropriation. What is lost can be recuperated. So one's own sense of the place in the world. See, there's nature, grizzly bears and all that other shit. And then there's people, right? In the Anthropocene. You have what we try and do the point that Zizek, as well as the author, is trying to make is that it's creativity. It is, really achieving one's full potential that is at work here. This is the same issue of the difference often divided between artisanship and being an artist, which is often not identical and incredibly problematic for some people. And then the estrangement is the relationship to property, which defines, in fact, the conundrum for every artist or artisan, who, on the one hand, wants to sell the work because it represents their creativity, and or the fact that they're on an assembly line and making stuff that they have no kind of signature relation to. For example, you will recall, of course, that some people actually tried to create better morale for the assembly line process by people having signing their work essentially on the assembly line. So property, and then a reappropriation within the context of the commons. So this is the whole story of this article, is to try and articulate these 5 things. And sometimes when it has blockages, that's where these 2 lines are. This is, and it depends on how elastic or inelastic this question of strong versus nature. The above version, figure 9, was strong nature, and weak nature as a kind of hypothesis has the same elements, the same 5 elements: estrangement that occurs between man and nature, and then man and his or her product, people and their products, and then a further exterioration in terms of what Marx is doing about the question about abstract labor, and to see that it is further divided and made more problematic, and made even more problematic in the context of the commons. So all of this hand waving about different categories is really important. It is a way of rearticulating the question of when Marxists talk about, oh, well, species being. Well, this is what species being is about. It's about getting back to this question that, in fact, some people may suggest we need to get back to, or that we could point towards in a kind of a hypothetical way, that is fully automated luxury communism, right? The Baschini's book is not the answer, but it's meant to point us in this kind of argument to see what this argument looks like from a cultural point of view. That is, that nature is incapable of guaranteeing all that becomes other to nature remains within nature. That is, at some moment, the Anthropocene kicks in, and it's actually more Hegelian than we think. And I think further, there's discussions of the different terms. And then, because I was stupid, that's almost the end. And so I can proceed on to the last section. And that is, this is a tail end, because I wanted to make it clear that sublation, which we looked at months ago, the Aufhebung, it is really an important idea. This is the kind of elevation. It's a kind of affirmation. It's also a negation. It is a negation of the negation in certain type of work. So I think it's important to think about that. Aufhebung is really at work. Expansion, inclusion, synthesis, sublimation, transfiguration. All of those things go on in good artwork. I would assert to you. Not only at the level of the artist, the producer, but also as in terms of the receiver, the consumer, or what patron. And then because I like asking AI questions that figure this out, and to me that's the basic use of AI, is to be a slightly better search engine. So David Harvey on sublation, he actually, despite his disclaiming his interest in Hegel, or not disinterest, but that he doesn't do a lot of Hegel. He does actually include all this. It is about how capitalism both preserves their minds, which is what we were talking about before, and then also this question of preservation. And the preservation is interesting to him because it does include the kind of problems of the built environment and space and time. And it also preserves sublation, and we can talk about that in a moment. It's what he was trying to refer to in David Harvey's book on postmodernism. And then, so the contradictions are useful. That is, the possibility for a new system that prioritizes sustainability and social justice, which is what his first book his first political book was on, but also might still involve some form of resource management. That is sublation. That's what we learn in the city for many people. So anyway, then there's nature thing, which I can talk about. So I'll talk about this in the context of average development, which is actually kind of interesting. It actually argues that it's sort of the underlying mechanism for settler colonialism in that sense. And then there's a artwork that I sort of want to refer to, and you can go find and look at it at yourself. With respect, it's kind of boring, but it is the longest film ever made, I think, at over 35 days in duration. It's there. It's kind of cool in one sense. On the other hand, it's like watching a bank camera. It is following the logistics of stuff around the world. And so you've got this camera sort of sitting on a ship, and you see the entire supply chain. And lest you think that that's unimportant, I was just watching the thing on the ship Ever Given that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and it's actually kind of interesting to see how problematic it was. And so it lest you think this is unimportant, this actually has incredible current day relevance. And then I did another thing. What was I looking for? I was looking for sublimation. Yeah, I think something symptom and sublimation. Sublation. That's right. I was looking at sublation, and I wanted to see that how film had a sublative element to it. So I asked the AI to do that, and it sort of did it, but didn't quite do it. But it gave me some interesting things, and we can see that there are some examples of that, and so that there's films on psychoanalysis, whether it's there's a Hitchcock film, the one on Freud, and that uses Salvador Dali sets, etc. And I can't remember what is it called. Anyway, we studied it for a whole term. I should remember the fucking thing. Technological determinism. That new film technology, IMAX versus Super 8, or using a iPhone to do an entire film. Tangerine, I think that's one done completely with an iPhone. And film history and continuity of this idea of cinematic technology. And the example that I want to use in a kind of tedious way is Multiplicity, the Michael Keaton film, where he suddenly decides he wants to clone himself because he wants to save. He just works too damn hard, and in order to fill in those particular spaces, he essentially builds his own reserve army. That is, he keeps making copies of himself, and they get fucked up. Number 4, I think, is the worst. It's just sort of, on the one hand, a kind of caricature of the disabled and developmentally challenged. So anyway, that's it. I'm going to stop. You can talk.
And I had a question. I had a question about the birth of consumerism on Earth. I remember when I was, 12 or 13 or something, I saw my first copy ever of Consumer Magazine on a magazine rack, and I felt physically ill.
Consumer Reports, you mean?
Yeah, Consumer Reports. I'm sorry. Yeah, Consumer Reports. I saw that. Yeah, it made me sick. And I remember thinking, that's what we have become. And as time went by, it became more and more true. And excuse me, one question I had was, did consumerism start here and then spread to Europe and the rest of the world?
Oh, no, not really. Markets have always been there. It's just that we've been able to mechanize them further. That's all. We've made things more efficient. If we were still
there were decisions made by this government back in the 40s, I think. It's like, what are we going to do with all these people?
Oh, yeah.
And what are they going to do with all their wages? Let's turn them into consumers. That's what I'm.
Sure, but that that motive was there in the 19th century. So
Oh.
No, it was.
Okay.
No, it was. I mean, it just got better organized in the 20th century, and because you had overproduction, that is surpluses of stuff, and you had weird controls of the production process or alterations. You know, people would save their bacon grease. You know, rationing during the wartime is an example.
Yeah, tin cans, bacon grease. I heard that, by the way, the stomp on your cans and give them to Uncle Sam to make tanks and all that. That really didn't amount to much of anything, but it was done for psychological.
Yeah, right. It conditioned you to, you know, sacrifice for the state, for the war effort. Let's put it that way.
Well, as somebody who always appreciated manufacturing and building stuff, to see this country turned into a bunch of consumers who don't know how to make anything, it's quite sad for me. And to see all our factories shipped overseas and so on, you know, it's just like, who would have thought this would happen here? I guess that's how naive I was.
It's not government. It's not government making those decisions. You know, you could, in a good libertarian way, say that the market was making those decisions. You know, you could make stuff cheaper overseas because you're paying people less. And the supply chain
that's true.
operates better.
That's true, but there were policy. Yeah.
I mean,
there were policy decisions made at high levels in the government.
Sure. I mean, you know, if you look at the post-war Japanese economy, right? You get them making cheap crap, and yes, they were making cheap crap. That is, for example, Japanese ceramics. You know, in terms of making dishware and shit like that. That's what they tried to reorganize. You know, they don't want to make in airplanes or guns or anything. You know, you want to have them make consumer goods. And that was a conscious decision in the post-war Japanese economy. And then at the same time, you had idiots like Deming going over there and saying, well, you know, you don't have to have big inventories. You can just do just in time. And it's an American idea. And then you extend that to the development of containers, which was designed by an American, that is intermodal freight. You know, container ports and shit like that. That's where we are now. Is just in time economy. If you plug up the Suez Canal, you fuck up the world economy for quite a while.
Yeah, true. Okay, that was thank you for letting me vent a little bit about consumerism.
Well, thank you too. But it's not an American invention. We made better use of it. That is with PR and advertising, and we're a shitload better at that. Although I would assert that, culturally speaking, the better ads are, I think, European ads. But that's just me. But you know, they because more people are trained in like semiotics and shit like that in Europe, and they can actually, you know, the things are much more efficient and more interesting than American idiocy. Okay, cool. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
James' comment?
Yes, I'm here.
I think of Apple and their planned obsolescence of their products. They have some of the best well-made products. The usability is incredible, the workmanship amazing, but they want you to buy new machines every other season, basically.
Yeah.
Able to take out the batteries. You used to be able to swap things out and repair it yourself. And at some point, because of the miniaturization and whatnot, and this planned obsolescence, they prevented you from doing that. There's been backlash and demand, and now they've kind of reversed it in certain machines. But also there is a movement of right to repair movement out there. So it is just a legislative issue, and activists need to get involved and push harder.
Mm-hmm.
You guys familiar with a company called Fairphone?
My hand is up.
Sorry.
And one other thing, there's a framework laptop that is all swappable components. built around the right to repair. It's another good one out there.
Cool.
John, go.
Okay, so yeah, I wouldn't blame Consumer Reports. What I would blame is advertising and a government that is not democratic, that is pressured by the corporations and funded by the corporations to do what the corporations want, which is to make Americans into mindless consumers and primarily consumers, not democratic citizens. And it was the corporations that pressured the government to allow them to deindustrialize the United States by shipping our factories overseas and allowing China to get enormous amounts of technological knowledge from that because of the arrangements that they made with the corporations, American corporations. So, again, it's a failure of democracy. I don't see Americans saying, yes, let's ship our manufacturing jobs overseas. That's what we want to do. And again, because the government's not operating in the interest of its people, you don't have the right to repair things, or you have to fight the government, to impose it on the corporations. But the power of the corporations is so extreme that, many times we can't even get that. And I mean, with cars, for example, we're going to be on a subscription model soon. Different features of the cars you have to pay for on an ongoing basis. It's a corporatocracy is what it is. And I'd say for about Consumer Reports, they don't take advertising. We're all consumers to a certain degree. I think what you're objecting to is the extent to which we're the only thing we're recognized as is consumers. But if you're going to consume, you might as well do it with some unbiased knowledge. And as far as I can tell, Consumer Reports endeavors to do that.
Yeah, the big question is whether consumer defense or support, can be done in a capitalist way, or a neoliberal way. That is, you can deregulate but still have Consumer Reports. That's sort of this Liz Warren view of the economy, is that we can just protect people here and there and everywhere, but the fact is you can't extend that protection throughout the entire economy unless you move to what? Socialism.
Hey, that sounds like something we could get behind.
And plastic is a real problem. I think that in a real, truly socialist economy, you would actually have controls over plastic production or plastic products. I mean, if you're going to have content control, you have actually content control of plastic. And it's not driven, paper or plastic at the supermarket. It's packaging, fucking packaging, man.
Packaging, yeah. And I'm sure James would agree with the the paper cups they give you at the Dunkin' Donuts or whatever takeout place you go to is lined with microplastics.
Yeah, BPA nowadays.
Yeah, all the poisonous chemicals. Yeah. I mean, this is crazy. We're letting these corporations, kill us so they can make a profit.
Because they don't give a shit until some regulator goes in and says, "Oh no, there's a hydrological effect in your styrofoam."
Oh. Nancy says she loves Walmart. I don't believe her.
I find styrofoam very filling.
Yum.
does it just stay in your stomach or does it eventually find its way out?
I'll leave that up to the imagination.
Eventually, it just kills you, and then you don't have to eat anymore.
There we go.
There you go.
Fatalism. I apologize for going over time. Thank you for your attention. We now return you to our regular scheduled whatever. Joe, you can cut the feed.
More question, but I'm vague on what it's related to, because it was early in the talk and you were mentioning farming and that we don't do it in the city. But
You cut out there, Joe. Joe, your audio cut out. Joe, can't hear you.
okay.
Joe?
It's because he's at the farm.
Sorry.
Speaking of farming.
Still can't hear you, Joe.